You are listening to Unseen Givens by Elton Thomas. Part 5, Chapters 17 through 20. Chapter 17, Mr. Hendrix's Confession. Part 1, A Glimpse into the Past. Laura settled into her seat across from Mr. Hendrix in his office, her notepad resting on her lap, a pen poised and ready. The atmosphere in the room was hushed, almost fragile, as if any sudden movement or word might shatter the careful silence between them. The usual steady confidence in Mr. Hendrix's demeanor was noticeably absent today, replaced by something that felt heavier, weighted by an unseen burden. Over the past several weeks, Laura had been working closely with Mr. Hendrix on the Printess project, coordinating nearly every detail of the company's most ambitious campaign yet. Their collaboration had drawn them together in ways that Laura hadn't anticipated, moving beyond professional discussions into the territory of shared late nights, mutual frustrations, and, occasionally, moments of unguarded humanity. But something was different today. She could feel it, like a faint tremor in the air. Bradley Hendrix was known for his calm, unflappable presence, a man of precision and control who rarely betrayed any hint of his own inner world. But today, he seemed distracted, his gaze flickering from the papers on his desk to the window, where the city skyline stretched out beneath a hazy afternoon sky. His posture was tense, his shoulders slightly hunched, as though he were carrying something far heavier than the responsibilities of his position. Laura cleared her throat softly, hoping to ease the tension. "Mr. Hendrix," she began, her voice gentle. "I've made some notes on the client's feedback from last week. There were a few areas they're concerned about, but I think with some adjustments, we can address their concerns without impacting our timeline." Mr. Hendrix nodded, but his response was delayed, as though he had to pull his attention back from some distant place. His eyes, usually so sharp and focused, were softened by a touch of melancholy, something that Laura hadn't seen before. "Right," he said, his voice quieter than usual. Let's go through it. I'd like to hear your perspective." As Laura began to walk him through the points on her notepad, she couldn't help but notice how his attention drifted, his mind seeming to wander to some other place, some other time. She paused, the words trailing off as she watched him, a faint sense of concern blooming in her chest. Are you okay, Mr. Hendrix?" she asked, her voice tentative but sincere. His eyes snapped back to hers, and for a brief moment, Laura saw something raw and unguarded in his expression, something that seemed so out of place on the face of the man who had built an empire from the ground up. He let out a slow breath, leaning back in his chair, his fingers tapping idly on the armrest. "I'm sorry, Laura. I know I haven't been myself lately. I have something on my mind." Laura waited, sensing that this was more than just a passing comment. She felt an unspoken invitation hanging in the air, a chance to listen, to be present in whatever he was about to share. I've been carrying something for a long time," he said finally, his gaze dropping to his hands. "Something that I don't often talk about." Laura's breath caught in her throat as she watched him. There was a vulnerability in his voice, a subtle tremor that made her heart ache. She had never seen him like this. So open, so unguarded. It was as though he had dropped the mask he wore every day, revealing a glimpse of the man behind the title, the man who had experienced pain, loss, and regret. "It was an accident," he continued, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Years ago. I was there, and I tried to help, but it wasn't enough. I couldn't save him." The weight of his words settled over the room, filling the silence with a somber intensity that made Laura's chest tighten. She could hear the pain in his voice, could feel the depth of his regret in every syllable. It was clear that this was something he had carried with him for a long time, a burden that had left its mark on his soul. I don't think I've ever truly forgiven myself," he murmured, his gaze distant, as though he were looking back through the years to that fateful day. "I did everything I could, but it wasn't enough. And that's something I'll have to live with for the rest of my life." Laura felt a lump form in her throat, her own heart aching in response to the sorrow etched across his face. She didn't know the details of the accident he was referring to. He hadn't shared enough for her to piece it together. But she could sense the depth of his pain, the way it lingered just beneath the surface, a quiet shadow that followed him everywhere he went. She hesitated, unsure of what to say. The words felt inadequate, too small to offer any real comfort in the face of such profound loss. "Mr. Hendrix," she began softly, her voice barely a whisper. I can't imagine what that must be like. But sometimes all we can do is try. Sometimes that's the only thing we have." He looked up at her then, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and sorrow. "I appreciate that, Laura. But sometimes trying isn't enough. Sometimes you have to live with the fact that you weren't able to save someone who mattered, and that's not an easy thing to carry." The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken pain and unexpressed emotions. Laura felt a strange sense of kinship with him in that moment, a connection that went beyond the professional realm and touched something deeper, something more personal. She didn't know the full story, but she could see the toll it had taken on him, the way it haunted his every move, the way it shaped the man he had become. And as she sat there, listening to him speak, she realized that there was more to Mr. Hendrix than she had ever imagined. More depth, more pain, more humanity. "I don't talk about this often," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "In fact, I don't talk about it at all. But sometimes it feels like it's eating away at me, like it's a wound that never really healed." Laura's heart ached for him, for the weight of the guilt he carried. She wanted to reach out, to offer some kind of comfort, but she knew that words alone wouldn't be enough to ease the burden he bore. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, her voice filled with genuine empathy. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Hendrix. I wish there was something I could say to make it better." He managed a faint, bittersweet smile, his gaze softening as he looked at her. "Thank you, Laura. I appreciate that more than you know. But some things you just have to learn to live with, no matter how hard it is." There was a pause, and Laura could see the weight of the years in his eyes, the way the memory lingered, a constant reminder of what he had lost. She wondered how he had managed to carry it all this time, to move forward despite the pain that clearly haunted him. And as she sat there, her own thoughts drifting to the loss she had endured, to the pain she had buried deep within her heart, she felt a strange sense of connection, a shared understanding that went beyond words. I think sometimes we hold on to the past because we're afraid to let go," she said softly, her gaze distant as she spoke. "But maybe letting go doesn't mean forgetting. Maybe it just means finding a way to move forward, even if it hurts." Mr. Hendrix looked at her, his expression thoughtful, as though he were considering her words. "Perhaps you're right," he said quietly, a hint of something softer, more hopeful, in his tone. "Perhaps it's time I found a way to make peace with it." For a brief moment, Laura saw a flicker of relief in his eyes, as if her words had lifted a small part of the burden he carried. She knew it wouldn't erase the pain, wouldn't undo the past, but maybe it was enough to help him take the first step toward healing. "Thank you, Laura," he said, his voice filled with quiet gratitude. "You have no idea how much this means to me." She nodded, her heart heavy with empathy as she met his gaze. "Any time, Mr. Hendrix. Any time." Part 2. Words Left Unspoken. Laura sat across from Mr. Hendrix, her heart heavy with the weight of his confession. She could still feel the lingering ache in his voice, a sorrow that seemed to seep into the walls of the room, leaving everything shrouded in a quiet, mournful stillness. He had opened up to her in a way she hadn't expected, had given her a glimpse into a part of himself that he kept hidden from everyone else. And as she looked at him now, she saw a man who was deeply human, burdened by regret and haunted by the memory of a tragedy he couldn't change. She offered him a small, understanding smile, hoping it would ease some of the pain she saw etched into his features. "Thank you for sharing that with me, Mr. Hendrix," she said gently. "I can't imagine how difficult it must be to carry something like that." He looked at her, his expression softened by a touch of gratitude, but beneath it, Laura could see the flicker of something deeper, something he was holding back. She didn't know the full story, didn't know the identity of the person he had tried and failed to save, but she could feel the weight of it in the air, a sorrow that seemed to fill the room like an unspoken presence. Mr. Hendrix took a slow breath, his gaze drifting away as if he were lost in the memory of that day. "There are things in life," he began, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Things that stay with you, no matter how much time passes. You think you can move on, that the memories will fade. But some things are always there, lingering just beneath the surface." Laura nodded, her eyes soft with empathy. She understood what he meant, perhaps more than he realized. She, too, had memories that lingered, that haunted her in quiet moments, memories of her son, Hank, and the tragedy that had shattered her world. But she kept that part of herself hidden, just as Mr. Hendrix did. It was a wound she carried in silence, a sorrow that belonged to her alone. "I think sometimes we hold on to things because we're afraid to let them go," she said softly, her gaze distant as she spoke. "Maybe we feel that if we let go, we'll lose a part of ourselves, or a part of the person we lost. But holding on doesn't always mean healing." Mr. Hendrix looked at her, his eyes reflecting a mixture of surprise and understanding. He hadn't expected her to say that, hadn't expected her to offer words that mirrored his own unspoken feelings. He wanted to tell her the truth then, to unburden himself of the secret he had carried for so long. But the words caught in his throat, trapped by the fear that they would only bring more pain. There was a long silence between them, heavy and contemplative, filled with the weight of things left unsaid. Mr. Hendrix opened his mouth as if to speak, but then closed it again, his gaze drifting to the window. He couldn't bring himself to say it, couldn't bear the thought of seeing the look on her face if she knew the full truth. "It's strange," he said finally, his voice barely audible. "How something that happened years ago can still feel so immediate, as if no time has passed at all." Laura nodded, her own thoughts echoing his words. She knew that feeling all too well, the way certain memories remained vivid, frozen in time, untouched by the years that had passed. The way her son's laughter, his smile, his voice, were still as clear in her mind as they had been on the last day she'd seen him. It was a strange kind of pain, one that never truly faded, but simply became a part of who she was. "Some things stay with us," she said quietly, meeting his gaze. "They shape us, in ways we don't always understand. But I think those memories, as painful as they are, they remind us of what we've lost, and what we've loved. And maybe that's a way of keeping those we've lost close to us." Mr. Hendrix looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and gratitude. He wanted to tell her then, to share the truth he had kept hidden for so long. But he couldn't. He couldn't bring himself to burden her with the knowledge of his failure, couldn't bear the thought of reopening the wound that he knew was still fresh for her. He managed a faint smile, though it was tinged with sadness. "You have a way with words, Laura. A way of making things feel less heavy." Laura returned his smile, though her own expression held a touch of melancholy. "I don't know about that. I think sometimes all we can do is try to understand each other, even if we don't have all the answers." He nodded, his gaze dropping to his hands, which were clasped tightly in his lap. There was a part of him that wanted to reach out, to tell her everything, to finally release the weight of the secret he had carried for so long. But he couldn't bring himself to do it. He couldn't risk the pain it might bring her, couldn't bear the thought of seeing the hurt in her eyes if she knew the full truth. "Sometimes, I wish—" He trailed off, his voice barely more than a whisper. "I wish I could go back. I wish I could change what happened. But life doesn't give us second chances, does it?" Laura shook her head, her own heart heavy with unspoken sorrow. "No, it doesn't. But I think maybe we can find a way to live with what we've lost, to honor the people we've loved, even if we can't bring them back." He looked at her then, his expression filled with a quiet intensity. For a moment, he thought about telling her everything, about finally unburdening himself of the truth. But the fear held him back, the fear that it would only cause her more pain. Instead, he nodded, his gaze softening as he looked at her. "You're wise beyond your years, Laura. Thank you for listening. I don't often talk about this. In fact, I don't talk about it at all. But it helps, having someone who understands." Laura smiled gently, though her eyes held a sadness that mirrored his own. "Any time, Mr. Hendrix. I'm here if you ever need to talk." He felt a pang of gratitude, a warmth that eased some of the weight he carried. He hadn't expected to find comfort in her words, hadn't expected her to understand so deeply. But somehow she had, and it was enough to give him a small measure of peace. They sat in silence for a few moments longer, the room filled with a quiet understanding that went beyond words. Laura could feel the weight of his sorrow, could sense the depth of his pain, and it made her ache to know that he carried it alone. She wanted to help him, to ease the burden he bore, but she knew that some things couldn't be fixed with words. As she rose to leave, she looked at him one last time, her expression filled with empathy. "Take care of yourself, Mr. Hendrix, and remember, you're not alone." He watched her go, his heart heavy with the knowledge of what he couldn't say. He wanted to call her back, to tell her the truth, to finally release the burden he had carried for so long. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, he sat there, alone with his memories, the weight of his past pressing down on him like a shadow that would never fade. And as Laura walked back to her desk, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to his story, something he hadn't shared. But she didn't press him. She respected his silence, just as she hoped he would respect hers. They were two people bound by loss, by memories that lingered like ghosts in the corners of their minds. And though they never spoke of it, they both knew that they carried a part of each other's pain, a shared understanding that went beyond words. Chapter 18. Office Dynamics. Part 1. Shifts in the Air. Laura walked into the office that morning with a bounce in her step, fueled by a fresh cup of coffee and a renewed sense of purpose. The tension from the previous day, the heavy, unexpected conversation with Mr. Hendrix, lingered in her mind, but today she was determined to leave it at the door. This morning, the office felt alive, buzzing with the usual mix of productivity and humor that had become a hallmark of her team. The moment she stepped into the open office space, she could feel the undercurrent of energy that always signaled something was up. Heads were leaning in close, eyes darting around, small clusters of people breaking apart as she walked in, only to reassemble once she passed. She grinned to herself. Office life at GivensCorp was never dull. Adam was already waiting for her by her desk, wearing a mischievous grin and holding a box of donuts. "Morning, Laura," he said, presenting the box like an offering. "Courtesy of your favorite team member." Laura raised an eyebrow, suppressing a smile as she set her things down. "Favorite, huh? Last time I checked, I had about 5 people vying for that title." Adam's grin widened. 5? I was thinking more like 2 or 3. Guess I need to up my game. "Oh, absolutely," Laura teased, reaching for a donut. She took a bite, savoring the sweet taste as she leaned back against her chair. "So, what's the buzz today? I feel like I walked in on the set of a soap opera." Adam shrugged nonchalantly, but his eyes sparkled with intrigue. "Oh, the usual office shenanigans. Word has it that Mindy might actually have a heart after all." Laura shot him a surprised look, her eyes narrowing slightly. "What's that supposed to mean?" "Don't act surprised," Adam said, leaning against her desk with a smirk. "She's been different lately, don't you think? Nicer, less hostile." Laura took another bite, chewing thoughtfully as she considered his words. It was true. Mindy had been acting differently. The subtle kindness, the small gestures, the way she'd gone out of her way to cover for Laura or share information that might have slipped through the cracks. It was a sharp contrast to the passive-aggressive barbs and obstacles she'd thrown Laura's way when she first joined. "Yes," Laura admitted, nodding slowly. "I've noticed it too. But I'm not holding my breath. She's probably just gearing up for a really elaborate prank." Adam chuckled, crossing his arms as he leaned in closer. "You're too cynical, Laura. People can change, you know." "Maybe," Laura replied, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "But this is Mindy we're talking about. The same person who tried to tank my first presentation by giving me the wrong file." "Hey, that was months ago," Adam countered. "She's come a long way since then. And besides, haven't you heard the saying? Keep your friends close and your enemies closer." Laura rolled her eyes, though she couldn't help but laugh. "Yeah, well, I'd rather keep my enemies far away, preferably on another floor." Adam grinned, clearly enjoying the banter. "See, this is why we love you. You've got that classic Laura Owens wit. Now, speaking of enemies, I hear Sharon from accounting has been having some trouble with her new intern." "Oh?" Laura raised an eyebrow, intrigued. Sharon's department was always a source of entertainment, thanks to her never-ending frustration with the interns she seemed to cycle through every few weeks. Adam leaned in, lowering his voice conspiratorially. Apparently, he accidentally deleted a week's worth of data because he thought he was organizing the files. Laura stifled a laugh, her eyes widening in mock horror. "Please tell me she didn't explode." "Oh, she did," Adam confirmed with a grin. "Rumor has it there was a quiet meeting in the conference room. Poor kid didn't stand a chance." Laura shook her head, chuckling as she took another bite of her donut. "Remind me to steer clear of Sharon today. I'd rather not get caught in the crossfire." "Good plan," Adam agreed, nodding sagely. "Now, what's on your agenda for today?" Before she could answer, the sound of footsteps approached, and they both looked up to see Mindy standing there, an uncharacteristically warm expression on her face. "Good morning, Laura." "Adam." She nodded politely at them both, a faint smile gracing her lips. Laura blinked, taken aback. There was a softness to Mindy's tone that was new, almost friendly. "Morning, Mindy," Laura replied, doing her best to hide her surprise. Mindy hesitated for a moment, as though considering her next words carefully. "Laura, I just wanted to say, that was a great job on the Printess report last week. Really impressive work. I think it's going to make a big impact." Laura stared at her, the unexpected compliment catching her completely off guard. "Oh, thank you, Mindy. I appreciate that." Mindy gave a small nod, her gaze briefly meeting Laura's before she looked away, as if embarrassed by her own kindness. "Anyway, keep up the good work. It's good to have someone reliable around here." And with that, she turned and walked away, leaving Laura and Adam staring after her in stunned silence. Adam let out a low whistle. "Well, would you look at that? Compliments from Mindy. Maybe the world really is ending." Laura shook her head, still processing the encounter. "I don't know what's gotten into her, but I think I kind of like it." "Don't get too used to it," Adam warned, though he was grinning. "She might just be softening us up before she pounces." "Maybe," Laura said with a small smile. "Or maybe she's just changing." Adam scoffed playfully. "Careful, Laura. You're starting to sound hopeful." "Hey, stranger things have happened," Laura replied with a shrug. "Who knows? Maybe Mindy and I will end up best friends one day." They both laughed at the absurdity of the idea, but as they did, Laura couldn't shake the feeling that there was something genuine in Mindy's shift. She still didn't fully trust it, but she couldn't deny that the office had felt different lately. Lighter somehow, more supportive. As the morning wore on, Laura found herself immersed in work, tackling a series of reports and emails that had piled up over the weekend. The office around her hummed with activity, the sounds of typing and soft laughter filling the air as her colleagues went about their day. Around mid-morning, Jared wandered over, looking slightly frazzled. "Hey Laura, can I borrow you for a sec? I'm trying to figure out this scheduling nightmare, and I could use a second opinion." Laura glanced up, stifling a laugh at the look of mild panic on Jared's face. "Sure thing. Let's take a look. They spent the next 15 minutes huddled over his computer, trying to untangle the mess of overlapping meetings and double-booked conference rooms. Laura's knack for organization came in handy, and with a few quick adjustments, they managed to streamline the schedule into something that resembled order. "Thank you," Jared said, exhaling in relief as he leaned back in his chair. "I don't know what I'd do without you, Laura. I swear, this job would be the death of me if it weren't for you." Laura chuckled, waving off the compliment. "Just doing my part to keep this place from falling apart. Besides, if you go down, I go down with you." Jared grinned, clapping her on the shoulder. "Good to know I've got someone on my side. Now, let's just hope Mindy doesn't rearrange everything again." They both laughed, but Laura couldn't help but think about how different things felt lately. Mindy, Jared, Adam, even the usually intense energy of the office had softened, as if everyone were working together toward a shared goal. It was almost like being part of a family, a dysfunctional, high-stakes, occasionally chaotic family, but a family nonetheless. And as she looked around the office, watching her colleagues work, chat, and laugh together, she felt a sense of contentment she hadn't experienced in a long time. It was strange how the smallest shifts could create such a profound change. But maybe that was the beauty of it, the way people could grow, adapt, and find new ways of relating to each other. Laura leaned back in her chair, a soft smile playing on her lips as she watched Adam and Mindy bicker good-naturedly over the last donut, Jared racing to finish his scheduling tasks, and the general buzz of the office carrying on around her. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she belonged. Part 2. The Elusive Ross Givens, yet again. Laura was determined. Today would be the day she finally met Ross Givens. She'd been chasing the elusive CEO through a labyrinth of meetings, client events, and missed appointments for so long now that it had become something of a personal mission. But this time, she'd double-checked the schedule, and Ross was definitely slated to attend the afternoon meeting on the new client proposal. No last-minute calls, no unexpected travel. She had confirmed it herself. With a freshly printed proposal in hand and a steely resolve, Laura made her way to the conference room 10 minutes early. The usual open office chatter was at a low hum behind her, but she tuned it out, her mind set on her goal. Today, there would be no interruptions. Today, she thought firmly, the Givens curse is finally broken. Laura entered the empty conference room, choosing a seat where she would be directly across from Ross, leaving no room for him to slip away without her noticing. She set her materials neatly in front of her, checked her phone one last time, and glanced at the door, mentally counting the minutes. She felt a small flicker of satisfaction at her proactive steps, silently daring fate to try to thwart her again. Adam poked his head through the door, flashing her a grin. "Look at you, early and determined. What, did you finally lay a trap for Ross?" She shot him a dry smile. "At this point, I might have to, but I figured sitting directly across from his chair would at least ensure that he can't just vanish into thin air." "Fingers crossed," Adam replied, sliding into the seat beside her and setting down his laptop. He leaned in conspiratorially. "But, everyone's placing bets again." Laura groaned, rolling her eyes. "Not this again. I thought we'd moved past that after last time." "Last time was just too good," he said, barely hiding his smirk. Stuck in the elevator. Sharon in accounting almost had a heart attack laughing when she found out. Laura shook her head, trying to suppress her own grin. "I swear, it's like the building itself is against me. But today's different. He's scheduled, he's confirmed, and I'm prepared." "Oh, sure, that's what we all said the last 5 times," Adam quipped, grinning. At exactly 1 minute before the meeting, Jared and a few other team members began to file in, taking their seats and settling their papers on the table. As each person came in, Laura's confidence grew. She could feel the excitement building, that electric hum of anticipation that only ever came when she thought she was finally going to meet Ross Givens. She checked her watch. 5 minutes past the hour. Laura's heart began to thump a little harder. "Stay calm," she told herself. "He's just running late. 10 minutes past the hour." Laura shifted in her seat, tapping her pen against the edge of her notepad, her pulse starting to race with a familiar mix of anxiety and frustration. 15 minutes. She caught Adam glancing at her, his expression caught between amusement and pity. She gave him a small glare, trying to keep her face composed, but inside, her hope was dwindling. Not again. Just then, Jared's phone buzzed, and he looked down at it with an exasperated sigh. He leaned forward, looking at the team with an apologetic smile. Looks like Mr. Givens is stuck in traffic. There's construction blocking the main road from his last meeting. Laura closed her eyes, breathing deeply as the frustration boiled up inside her. Construction? Now it was traffic? How many obstacles could possibly stand between her and this one man? Adam, catching her expression, nudged her with his elbow, trying to hide his grin. Hey, traffic. It's a classic. I mean, at least it's not another power outage, right? Laura let out a low, irritated laugh, shaking her head. This is insane. I swear, Adam, I am never going to meet him. Oh, don't say that. Adam grinned. Not when you've got the whole office rallying around the great Givens hunt. Besides, you have to admit it's a little funny. Funny? Laura repeated, her voice laced with mock disbelief. I'm convinced the universe itself doesn't want us to meet. If this keeps up, I'm going to start believing Ross Givens is just a very well-constructed hologram. Adam burst out laughing, quickly covering his mouth to stifle the sound as a few of their colleagues glanced over. You mean to tell me you're falling for the Bigfoot theory? Laura sighed, but she couldn't help the faint smile that tugged at her lips. I don't know, Adam. This is starting to feel like some kind of elaborate prank. Oh, it's more than a prank, he said with a smirk. It's an office legend. I'm just saying, you're like our own personal Ross Givens mythbuster. It's noble work. Laura rolled her eyes, but the glint in her eyes betrayed her amusement. If I ever do meet him, I'm taking a selfie for proof. I don't care if it's at the coffee machine or during a fire drill. I'm documenting it. They both stifled their laughter as Jared began the meeting, glancing at the empty seat where Ross should have been. Well, it looks like Mr. Givens will join us if he can get through the construction. In the meantime, let's dive in. Laura bit her lip, forcing herself to focus as Jared launched into the agenda. She nodded along, taking notes and contributing where she could, but her mind kept drifting back to the empty seat across from her, to the man who seemed as elusive as a ghost. After the meeting wrapped up, Adam leaned over, giving her a sympathetic smile. You know what they say, Laura. The chase is half the fun. She snorted. In that case, I think I've had more than my fair share of fun. As they made their way back to their desks, Adam kept up his playful banter. You know, at this point, I think you're more likely to win the lottery than meet Ross, or maybe get abducted by aliens. Don't even start, Laura groaned, laughing despite herself. I can already hear the theories people are going to come up with next. Speaking of theories, Adam said, grinning as they walked past Sharon's desk. Sharon raised her head, her eyes sparkling with mischief as she shot Laura a knowing look. Well, well, if it isn't the legendary Miss Owens, Sharon teased, crossing her arms as she leaned back in her chair. Did I hear right? Another near miss with Ross? Laura rolled her eyes, though she was smiling. Yes, yes, laugh it up. He's stuck in traffic. At this point, I wouldn't be surprised if he's stuck in a wormhole next time. Sharon laughed, shaking her head. I don't know, Laura. At this rate, I think you're destined to never meet the man. We're going to start calling him your imaginary friend. Imaginary friend? Laura repeated, raising an eyebrow. Trust me, if he were imaginary, I'd have made him appear by now. This is just beyond belief. Hey, we all appreciate the suspense, Sharon said with a grin. You're keeping things exciting around here. Laura let out a long sigh, though she couldn't deny that the whole thing had taken on a life of its own. The Givens curse, as they called it, had become a running joke throughout the office. People stopped by her desk just to ask if she'd had any recent sightings, as if Ross were some kind of mythical creature that only appeared under very specific conditions. As the day wore on, the teasing continued, with colleagues stopping by to offer her their condolences on her latest near miss. Next time, Laura, called Jared from across the room with a wink. You're bound to meet him eventually, right? I wouldn't count on it, Laura replied with a sigh, though her voice held a note of humor. At this point, I think I'm cursed. Adam, never one to miss an opportunity, grinned at her. Hey, look on the bright side. You've got a whole support group now. We'll form a club. Friends of the Elusive Ross Givens. Laura chuckled, shaking her head as she returned to her work. Despite the mounting frustration, the humor of it all softened the blow. Her colleagues' camaraderie, their good-natured teasing. It turned what could have been a maddening ordeal into something almost fun. But as the day came to a close, Laura found herself alone at her desk, her thoughts drifting back to the empty seat in the conference room, to the man who continued to slip through her fingers. She sighed, tapping her pen against the edge of her notebook as a thought crossed her mind. One of these days, she thought, I will meet Ross Givens, and when I do, he's going to hear all about this. But until then, she would keep chasing him, through meetings, through client events, and through every absurd obstacle fate decided to throw in her path. For now, at least, the legend of Ross Givens would live on. Chapter 19. The Accident Memory. Part 1. The Fog Lifts. Laura sat at her desk, her mind miles away from the steady hum of GivensCorp's office. Outside, the early afternoon sun bathed the city in a soft glow, casting long, slender shadows across the floor. She watched them absent-mindedly, her fingers tracing a slow, deliberate line along the edge of her notepad. The memory had come on suddenly, unbidden, like a silent, haunting echo from a distant past she'd tried so hard to keep buried. She hadn't thought about the accident in a long time. At least, not in the way she was remembering it now. Usually, it was just a fleeting image, a flash of emotion she quickly buried, a way to keep herself from reliving the pain. But today, it was different. The memory wasn't fleeting. It was stubborn, clinging to her mind like a persistent whisper, urging her to remember. Her hands felt strangely cold as she clasped them tightly in her lap, a wave of unease rippling through her. She glanced around the office, hoping for something to distract her, but the memory wouldn't release its grip. It was as though a floodgate had been opened, and now she was drowning in it. It was a cool, clear day. She remembered that now. The sunlight had filtered softly through the trees, casting delicate patterns on the ground, the kind of day that felt like it had been drawn from a dream. She and Hank had been in the car, her son happily chattering in the back seat, his laughter filling the small space with a warmth that always seemed to make her heart swell. He had been talking about his favorite dinosaur, passionately explaining why the T-Rex was, in his words, the coolest dinosaur ever. "Mom, did you know T-Rexes could crush bones with their teeth?" he had said, his voice full of wonder. She had laughed, glancing at him in the rearview mirror, her heart brimming with affection. "Oh, really? Well, I guess I'd better watch out then, huh?" "Yup," Hank had said, nodding seriously, though there was a playful glint in his eyes. "But don't worry, Mom. I'd protect you." She could still see his smile, bright and carefree, as if it were happening right in front of her. And then, as suddenly as the joy of that memory had surfaced, the scene shifted, darkening. She remembered the road stretching ahead, open and calm, the kind of stretch where she could let her mind wander, allowing herself to relax. There was no warning, no sense of impending danger. Just the sudden, heart-stopping blur of lights, the screech of tires, the jarring impact that shattered the peace of the day. The memory hit her like a physical blow, and she could feel her hands start to shake, her breath catching in her throat. She squeezed her eyes shut, the office around her fading away as she allowed herself to sink into the memory, to confront the details that had always been hidden in the shadows. There was a strange silence after the impact, a silence that felt unnatural, oppressive. Her head had throbbed with a dull, persistent ache, her body heavy and sluggish. She could feel the rough texture of the airbag against her cheek, the smell of smoke and something metallic filling her nostrils. "Hank." The word had slipped from her lips, soft and desperate. She had turned, her heart pounding with terror, her vision blurred and unfocused. But as her gaze settled on the back seat, the world had come into sharp, devastating clarity. Hank lay still, his small frame crumpled in the seat, his head resting at an unnatural angle. The sight had ripped through her, a pain so raw, so visceral, that she could feel it even now, sitting in the quiet of her office. Her hands instinctively clenched into fists, her nails digging into her palms as she fought to keep the memory at bay, to stop herself from sinking further into the darkness. But there was more. She knew there was more. A figure had appeared, moving toward the car, blurred and indistinct. She could recall the sensation of being lifted, of strong arms supporting her as she stumbled, barely able to hold herself upright. Her mind struggled to piece together the fragments, the edges of her memory sharp and jagged, like broken glass. He had spoken to her, words she couldn't quite recall, but the tone was clear, calm, reassuring, a voice that had cut through the haze of her panic, grounding her in the midst of chaos. He had been there, a stranger who had offered her comfort, who had tried to help her even as she felt her world collapsing. She took a shaky breath, her fingers trembling as she pressed them to her temples. She could feel the faint throb of a headache forming, a dull ache that seemed to mirror the pain of the memory. Her heart felt heavy, her chest tight, as though she were carrying the weight of that day all over again. "Are you okay, Laura?" The voice startled her, jolting her back to the present. She looked up to see Adam standing by her desk, his expression filled with concern. "Oh. Sorry, Adam," she said, forcing a smile, though her voice felt thick, the remnants of the memory clinging to her like a shadow. "I was just lost in thought." Adam studied her for a moment, his gaze softening. "Are you sure you're okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." Laura forced a laugh, though the sound felt hollow. "I'm fine, really. Just thinking about some things." "Work things?" he asked, though there was a note of suspicion in his voice. She shook her head. "Not really, just something personal." Adam nodded slowly, giving her a reassuring smile. "Well, if you need anything, you know where to find me." She offered him a grateful nod, watching as he returned to his desk. But the moment he was gone, the memory surged forward again, filling her mind with images she had spent so long trying to forget. The sound of sirens had filled the air, piercing and relentless, blending with the muffled voices of the paramedics as they worked to free her from the wreckage. She could remember the cold metal of the stretcher, the faint prick of the IV in her arm, the sterile smell of antiseptic that had clung to her skin. But there was one image that lingered, sharper and more vivid than the rest. The stranger's face, his expression filled with a sorrow that seemed to echo her own. He had been there, his hand resting gently on her shoulder, his eyes filled with a kindness that had somehow broken through her grief. She had never known his name, never had the chance to thank him. But he had been there, a steady presence in the midst of her despair, a quiet strength that had helped her through the darkest moment of her life. Laura closed her eyes, her fingers pressing against her temples as she tried to shake off the memory, but it clung to her, stubborn and unyielding, a reminder of the pain she had carried with her for so long. And now, as she sat in the quiet of her office, she realized that the memory was no longer content to remain hidden. It was surfacing, demanding her attention, forcing her to confront the parts of herself she had tried so hard to bury. She took a deep breath, her hands still trembling as she reached for her water bottle, hoping the coolness would ground her, bring her back to the present. She couldn't afford to get lost in the past, not now. Not when she had worked so hard to rebuild her life, to move forward. But as she sipped the water, the stranger's face lingered in her mind, his eyes filled with a quiet understanding, a compassion that had left a lasting mark on her soul. Who was he? She wondered, the question lingering in her mind like a whisper. She had never thought to ask, had been too consumed by her grief to even consider it. But now, as the memory resurfaced, she felt a strange urge to know, to finally understand the full story of that day. Her fingers brushed against the edge of her notepad, tracing the familiar curve of her son's name scrawled in the margins, a habit she had developed over the years, a way to keep him close even in his absence. Hank. She felt the familiar ache in her chest, a hollow emptiness that would never fully heal. She closed her eyes, letting the memory wash over her, allowing herself to feel the pain, the loss, the love that had defined her life since that day. And as she sat there, lost in the memory, she felt a strange sense of clarity, a realization that perhaps, after all these years, it was time to confront the past, to finally understand the full truth of what had happened. She didn't know where to begin, didn't know how to unravel the tangled threads of memory and emotion that had kept her bound to that day. But she knew, with a quiet certainty, that she couldn't keep running from it forever. Taking a deep breath, she opened her eyes, her gaze steady, her heart heavy with the weight of the past. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with shadows and questions she wasn't sure she could answer. But for the first time in a long time, she felt ready to face it. One step at a time, she thought, her fingers tracing the outline of Hank's name on the notepad. One memory at a time. And as she sat there, lost in the quiet of her office, she knew that the journey would be long, the pain deep. But she was ready. Ready to finally confront the truth of what had happened, to face the memories she had tried so hard to forget. The past was calling, and this time, she would answer. Part 2. Shadows of the Past. The familiar hum of the office buzzed around Laura, but the sounds felt distant and muffled. Her thoughts lingered far away, caught in memories that pulled her back to the day her life had fractured irreparably. Images of Sam and Hank filtered through her mind, uninvited but vivid, each detail striking with the force of memory she couldn't escape. The air had been clear that day, remarkably so. She remembered the way the sunlight fell across Sam's face in the front seat as they'd driven, the warmth in his eyes as he looked over at her, talking about the upcoming family plans. And then Hank, in the back seat, his voice bright and playful as he chattered about dinosaurs. "Mom, did you know that a T-Rex could crush bones with its teeth?" Hank had said, a serious edge to his tone that had made both Laura and Sam smile. "I did know that," she had replied, glancing back at him with a grin. "But I'm glad to know you're the expert, Hank. You'll keep us safe from the T-Rex, right?" "Of course," Hank had said proudly, nodding with determination that made them both laugh. "If one ever comes close, I'll protect you and Dad." She could still remember the smile on Sam's face, the way he had reached over to squeeze her hand, his expression soft with love. It was one of those small, quiet moments of joy she had cherished, a moment that now seemed so fleeting, so fragile. Then the memory shifted. The sunlight had given way to a blinding flash of headlights, and the laughter was replaced by the sharp, jarring impact that had shattered their world. There had been no time to react, no time to think. Just a sudden, heart-stopping jolt that threw them all forward, the sounds of metal crunching, glass shattering. Her vision blurred with the force of the impact, the world around her collapsing into darkness. She remembered regaining consciousness, the heavy weight of her own body pinning her down. Her hands fumbled, searching for Sam, for Hank, but all she could feel was the harsh texture of the airbag and the cold press of the car's interior against her skin. Hank. The word had slipped from her lips, faint and desperate. She turned, barely able to focus through the dizziness, her eyes searching for her son. And then she saw him, crumpled in the back seat, his small frame still and silent. The sight had shattered her, a pain so deep that it felt like her heart was being torn from her chest. But when she turned to Sam, her own breath caught. He was gone. There was no light in his eyes, no warmth in his face. His hand, which had held hers only moments before, lay limp by his side, lifeless. The memory pressed down on her, suffocating and relentless, filling her with an ache that left her frozen in place. She could still feel the cold, numbing shock, the way her mind had refused to process what she was seeing. The reality of it, the finality of it, had been too much to bear. Gone. The word echoed in her mind, sharp and bitter. She had lost them both in an instant, her world shattered, her heart broken beyond repair. The weight of that loss had never truly left her. It had become a part of her, a shadow that lingered in the quiet moments, a reminder of everything she had lost. Across the room, Mr. Hendrix watched her, his gaze filled with a quiet sorrow. He could see the pain etched into her expression, the way she seemed lost in a memory she couldn't escape. He felt his own guilt rise, a familiar ache that twisted in his chest, reminding him of the day he had failed to save her family, the day he had become a part of her tragedy. But he kept his distance, the words he wanted to say trapped in his throat. He didn't know how to bridge the gap between them, how to offer her comfort when he was the one who had failed her. The weight of his guilt held him back, binding him in silence, as he watched her struggle with the memories that he knew all too well. Lim. The sound came to her, soft and gentle, like a whisper from somewhere beyond the veil. She closed her eyes, the ache in her chest growing sharper as she remembered the way Hank would call to her, his voice bright and innocent. "Love you, Mom." It had been his way of saying goodnight, his way of reminding her that he loved her. A tear slipped down her cheek, unnoticed, as she allowed herself to sink into the memory, to let herself feel the love, the loss, the ache that would never fade. And in that moment, she knew that they were still with her, in some small way, their love a part of her that nothing could take away. Across the room, Mr. Hendrix looked away, unable to bear the sight of her pain. The weight of his guilt was too much, the knowledge of what he had failed to prevent pressing down on him like a burden he would carry for the rest of his life. He wanted to tell her, wanted to offer her some form of comfort, but he couldn't bring himself to do it. Laura sat in silence, her fingers brushing over the photograph of Hank and Sam on her desk, their smiles bright and full of life. She took a slow, steady breath, grounding herself, finding strength in the love they had shared. She could feel them with her, their memory a steady presence in her heart. And as she sat there, lost in the quiet of the office, she knew that somehow she would carry on. She would honor them, hold them close, and let their love guide her, even in the darkest moments. Chapter 20. Another Missed Meeting. Part 1. The Cyber Attack and the Unseen Ross. The office hummed with anticipation as Laura made her way down the hall, a fresh stack of papers balanced in her arms. Today was the day, or so she had convinced herself, for what felt like the 100th time. After months of bizarre near misses and last-minute interruptions, she was finally scheduled to meet Ross Givens, the elusive CEO she'd been chasing through a series of unfortunate events and laughable mishaps. The morning had started on a promising note. She had checked the meeting schedule 3 times, confirming his attendance at the quarterly review that would cover both the Printess project and upcoming partnerships. Ross was supposed to chair the meeting, offering his personal insights, and Laura had prepared meticulously, ensuring every detail was in place, every data point memorized. This was, after all, her chance to impress him face to face. Laura entered the conference room a solid 20 minutes before the meeting, glancing around at the arrangement of chairs, the gleaming table, and the polished presentations loaded onto the screen. She took her seat near the head of the table, directly across from where Ross would sit. Her fingers tapped the edge of her notepad as she glanced around, waiting for the room to fill up. One by one, her colleagues began to file in, chatting casually as they settled into their seats, laptops and notepads opening, mugs of coffee steaming in hand. The usual office chatter filled the air, Adam's voice laughing over something with Sharon, Jared giving a thumbs up to Mindy from across the room. There was an unmistakable excitement, a buzz, knowing that Ross himself would be leading the meeting. Adam slid into the seat beside her, flashing her a grin. "Well, well, ready to finally break the curse, Laura?" Laura gave him a determined nod, though her expression held a glimmer of wariness. "Don't jinx it, Adam. I've done everything I can to ensure that nothing goes wrong this time. He's confirmed, the meeting is scheduled, and I am sitting right here." Adam laughed, raising his hands in mock surrender. "I won't say another word. But there's already a pool going on in the break room. Half the office is betting that some disaster will keep you two from actually meeting." Laura rolled her eyes, though she couldn't help the smile tugging at her lips. That's not exactly comforting. I'm starting to think Ross is the Loch Ness Monster. Or Bigfoot, Adam suggested, grinning. Seen by everyone except for one poor soul who can never quite get a glimpse. Laura let out a soft groan. "Enough, Adam. This is the day. It has to be." Before long, the room was nearly full, the buzz of conversation ebbing as the start time approached. Laura checked her watch, her pulse quickening. 3 minutes. Ross was supposed to arrive in 3 minutes. She allowed herself a small, hopeful smile, glancing at the door with bated breath. Suddenly, Jared's phone buzzed on the table, the sound punctuating the quiet that had settled over the room. He picked it up, his brow furrowing as he read the text. The crease in his forehead deepened, and he exchanged a quick, tense glance with Adam. Looks like we might have a slight delay," Jared announced, his tone cautious. Laura's heart sank, but she forced herself to stay calm. "A delay? Is Mr. Givens still coming?" Jared hesitated, glancing at his phone again. "Yes, but there's been an issue. A cyber attack on one of our partner networks. Ross had to get on an emergency call to handle it." The words hung in the air, heavy and unwelcome. Laura felt her shoulders slump, the weight of disappointment pressing down on her. Not again. Her mind raced, filled with a mix of disbelief and frustration. Every time, without fail, something seemed to conspire against her, preventing her from meeting the one person she had been waiting months to see. Adam leaned over, giving her a sympathetic smile. "Hey, look on the bright side. At least it's not a fire drill this time." Laura let out a huff of laughter, though it was tinged with exasperation. "Oh, sure. And I suppose I should be thankful he didn't get stuck in the elevator again, too?" "Exactly," Adam replied, his eyes twinkling. "Silver linings, Laura." But Laura's patience was wearing thin. She closed her notebook with a decisive snap, her expression darkening as she fought to keep her frustration in check. She had been prepared, had done everything she could to make sure today went smoothly. And now, because of a cyber attack on some remote network, her long-awaited meeting with Ross had been reduced to another chapter in the saga of missed connections. The room was silent for a moment as everyone absorbed the news. Then, one by one, her colleagues began to chuckle, soft laughter rippling through the room as they exchanged amused glances. "Hey, Laura," Sharon called from across the table, her tone playful. "At this rate, we're going to have to start calling Ross your imaginary friend." Jared smirked, shaking his head as he added, "Yeah, maybe we should just put up a cardboard cutout of him for you, Laura. You could at least pretend you've met him." Laura crossed her arms, giving them both a withering look. "Ha ha, very funny. You all realize that this is entirely beyond my control, right?" "Oh, we know," Adam replied, grinning. "But come on, Laura, even you have to admit it's hilarious. I mean, what are the odds?" "Apparently very high," Laura muttered, though she couldn't help but laugh along with them. The absurdity of the situation had taken on a life of its own, a running joke that she was beginning to feel she might never live down. Jared, sensing her frustration, leaned in and patted her shoulder sympathetically. "Hey, look at it this way. At least you're keeping the office entertained. Who knew you'd be the star of GivensCorp's most infamous saga?" Laura shot him a mock glare, but her smile softened the expression. "Glad to be of service, I suppose, though I'd prefer to be known for my actual work. Thank you very much." The room erupted in laughter, and for a moment, the disappointment faded, replaced by the camaraderie of shared humor. Laura found herself relaxing, letting go of her irritation as she joined in the laughter. After all, if she couldn't laugh about it, what else could she do? But beneath the laughter, she could feel a persistent ache, a quiet frustration that gnawed at her. She had wanted this meeting, had looked forward to it, and now it felt as though fate itself were conspiring against her. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to let it go, to accept the reality of the situation. As the meeting dissolved into smaller conversations, Adam leaned over, giving her a knowing smile. "Don't worry, Laura. One day, you'll meet him. And when you do, it's going to be epic." Laura sighed, her smile rueful. "At this point, I think I might faint from the shock." "Don't worry," he said with a laugh. "I'll be there to catch you." They both laughed, the tension easing as they shared the joke. And though she still felt the sting of disappointment, Laura knew that she wasn't alone. Her colleagues, her friends, they were all with her, sharing in the absurdity, the humor, and the challenge of navigating a world that seemed determined to keep her from meeting the one man she had been waiting for. As the conversations continued, Laura allowed herself to relax, to let go of her frustration, if only for a little while. She had done everything she could, had prepared and planned, and in the end, that was all anyone could ask. And maybe, she thought with a smile, the journey was just as important as the destination. Part 2. The Givens curse hits again. Laura leaned back in her chair, fingers pressed against her temples as she tried to calm the simmering frustration boiling inside her. She had been so close this time. So close. A few more minutes, and she would have finally met Ross Givens, putting an end to the absurd saga of near misses that had plagued her since the day she joined GivensCorp. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. Cyber attack, she muttered, shaking her head as if to make sense of it. Of all the things, a cyber attack. Adam, sitting beside her, did his best to hide his smirk, but failed miserably. Well, Laura, you've had just about every type of obstacle known to man. Fire drills, traffic jams, power outages, even the elevator going haywire. This cyber attack is a nice touch, don't you think? Gives it that 21st century flair. Laura groaned, casting a withering look in his direction. I swear, Adam, if you make one more joke about this, I'm going to sign you up for every pointless training seminar I can find. He threw his hands up in mock surrender. Whoa, careful. You're starting to sound like Mindy on a Monday morning. I get it, though. This curse is relentless. Sharon from accounting poked her head in, catching the last part of the conversation. Her eyes sparkled with amusement, and Laura felt her stomach sink as Sharon's mischievous grin widened. Laura, she called out, her voice dripping with playful sympathy. I heard about the meeting. Tough luck, huh? Sharon, don't even start, Laura warned, though she couldn't help the small smile tugging at her lips. Hey, it's not my fault you seem to be cursed. I mean, really. How many times have you almost met him? Sharon leaned against the doorframe, ticking off each one on her fingers. There was the elevator fiasco, the fire drill, the traffic delay, and now a cyber attack. This is some kind of legendary bad luck. Bad luck? Laura shot back, her voice tinged with exasperation. This is beyond bad luck. It's like the universe itself is conspiring against me. At this point, I'd have better luck meeting the president. Adam chimed in, laughing. Hey, maybe that should be your new strategy. Run into the president, tell him about the Givens curse, and he'll probably put you on the evening news. Laura rolled her eyes, but she couldn't stop the smile that crept onto her face. Despite her frustration, there was something undeniably funny about the whole situation. It had taken on a life of its own, an office legend that had her at its center. The Givens curse, as they had all taken to calling it, had become a daily source of entertainment for everyone around her, and, admittedly, for Laura herself. Oh, I can see it now, Sharon continued, still grinning. News headline, Woman finally meets elusive boss after presidential intervention. The room erupted in laughter, and Laura let herself laugh along with them, shaking her head in disbelief. She glanced down at her notes, the meticulously prepared agenda that would now go unshared, and sighed dramatically. Maybe I should just accept my fate. Maybe I'm destined to work here for the rest of my life without ever laying eyes on the man who hired me. Oh, come on, Jared piped up from across the room, his tone light. Look on the bright side. At least you're memorable. The Givens curse has made you a legend, Laura. People will be talking about this long after you're gone. Laura threw him a look of mock horror. Gone? Jared, I'll be on my deathbed, still waiting to meet Ross Givens. At this rate, I'll have to leave instructions in my will for someone to track him down and tell him I existed. Adam patted her on the shoulder, his grin widening. Now, don't get too morbid. Think of it as a challenge. Who else in this office can say they have a legitimate workplace mystery? Oh, great, she replied, rolling her eyes. Just what I always wanted. A workplace mystery named after me. Really, I feel so accomplished. The laughter swelled again, and Laura felt her own spirits lifting, the camaraderie of her colleagues softening the edge of her disappointment. It was ridiculous, absurd even. But there was something comforting about knowing that she wasn't alone in this. Her colleagues had become a part of the story, the Givens curse a shared joke that had drawn them all together. Mindy sauntered over, her eyes alight with mischief. So, Laura, what's the plan for next time? Maybe you could schedule the meeting in a fireproof, elevator-free, cyber-attack-proof bunker? Oh, trust me, I'm considering it, Laura replied, unable to suppress her smile. At this rate, I might need to reserve a seat at the Pentagon to guarantee he actually shows up. The room burst into laughter, and Laura leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms as she shook her head in exasperation. This isn't a joke, you know. I've prepared for this meeting 4 different times, and every single time, something ridiculous happens to prevent it. Well, Adam said, leaning over with a grin. You could always try summoning him. Summoning him, Laura repeated, raising an eyebrow. Yeah, like one of those seances. Light a few candles, hold hands, and call his name 3 times. Ross Givens, come forth. Adam's voice took on a mock-serious tone, his eyes wide as he pretended to channel some mystical energy. Laura laughed, holding up her hands. Adam, if you keep this up, I'll start believing in it. Adam chuckled, leaning back in his chair. Hey, if it works, it works. Sharon grinned, joining in. Maybe you could create a Givens summoning ritual. That way, he can never escape you. Oh, now you're just being ridiculous, Laura replied, though she was laughing. Next, you'll tell me to wear a charm or carry some good luck object every time he's scheduled to be in the office. Well, it couldn't hurt, Jared added, his eyes twinkling with amusement. I'm telling you, Laura, the entire office is invested in this now. At this rate, we're all living through your quest to find Givens. Quest? Laura echoed, shaking her head in disbelief. This isn't a quest. It's a misadventure. One I never asked to be a part of, mind you. Misadventure or not, Adam replied, grinning. You've become GivensCorp's very own legend, and we're all here to cheer you on. The laughter slowly quieted, but the warmth in the room lingered, wrapping around Laura like a comforting blanket. Her frustration had reached its peak, but somehow, being surrounded by her colleagues, sharing in the absurdity of it all, made it easier to bear. She glanced around at the faces of the people who had become more than just co-workers, who had become friends, allies in the strange and unpredictable world of GivensCorp. Taking a deep breath, Laura allowed herself to smile, the weight of the day's disappointment lifting as she joined in the laughter. Maybe she would meet Ross someday, maybe not. But for now, she had something just as valuable. The support and humor of the people around her, the shared stories and jokes that had transformed the frustration of missed meetings into a memory she would look back on with fondness. All right, she said, leaning back with a grin. Next time, I'm bringing a horseshoe, a 4-leaf clover, and the entire contents of a fortune cookie factory. Let's see the Givens curse try to stop me then. Her colleagues erupted into laughter, and Laura felt her own spirits rise, the frustration melting away in the face of their camaraderie. Maybe the Givens curse wasn't so bad after all.